Albert Francis Capone was born on December 4th, 1918, into a name that would follow him like a shadow for the rest of his life. He didn't choose the name. He didn't choose the father. He didn't choose the deaf condition in his left ear that doctors would later link, in whispered diagnoses his parents never fully acknowledged, to the disease his father carried when he was conceived. He didn't choose any of it. Not the Brooklyn tenement where his earliest years unfolded, not the sudden Chicago wealth that replaced poverty, not the bodyguards who followed him to school, not the reporters who photographed him at his first communion. He was Al Capone's son. That was the central fact of his existence. And for most of his life, the fact he was most desperate to escape. But escaping a name is harder than it looks, especially when that name is written in headlines, stamped into history books, and recognized by strangers in every city in America. This is the story of a man who tried. In the early years, Sonny Capone had no reason to understand that his life was unusual. Wealth to a child is simply the texture of normal. His father was present, more present than most Chicago fathers of that era, because Al Capone, whatever his failings as a human being, was a devoted family man, in particular Italian-American tradition that placed the family above all other loyalties. He showed up to Sonny's school events. He played with him on Sunday afternoons. He laughed loudly and without restraint at Sonny's jokes. He brought him gifts. Too many gifts, May always said, too much of everything. Your father loves you, May would tell Sonny, and it was never a complicated statement. Whatever else Al Capone was. And even as a young boy, Sonny understood that his father was something complicated, something that made adults around him speak carefully. The love was uncomplicated, direct, real, but there were signals, even early, that Sonny's childhood was not like other childhoods. The bodyguards were one signal. They were always there at a careful distance, men in suits who stood at the edge of the schoolyard, who followed the family car at a distance, who materialized whenever Capone family went anywhere in public. Sonny's classmates noticed them. Some were impressed. Some were afraid. Most simply marked Sonny as different, which, at the age of 7 or 8, is not a comfortable thing to be. His hearing loss was another signal, or rather, the way adults reacted to it. The loss was significant in his left ear, nearly complete. Doctors fit him with hearing aids, clunky devices that drew attention and occasionally prompted cruelty from other children. His parents treated the condition with a fierce protectiveness that sometimes tipped into overcompensation. Al, in particular, would become visibly distressed whenever Sonny struggled with his hearing, a distress that Sonny, perceptive even as a child, since had something to do with guilt, though he couldn't have named it that way at 7 years old. School was complicated. Sonny was a good student when he could hear the lessons, which wasn't always. He made friends, lost them, made new ones. He was quiet where his father was loud, thoughtful where his father was impulsive, careful where his father was extravagant. The priests at his Catholic school treated him with a particular wariness reserved for children of notorious parents. Not unkindly, but always with an awareness that the child across the desk was connected to something larger and darker than the ordinary family drama. By the time Sonny was 12, the newspapers had become a constant presence in his life, not as entertainment, but as threat. Every story about his father was a story that followed Sonny to school the next day, that sparked questions he didn't know how to answer, that reminded everyone around him of what the Capone name meant. "Is your father really a killer?" A classmate asked him once, with a blunt directness that children deploy before they learn social tact. Sonny didn't answer. He went home that afternoon and asked his mother, "What does Papa do?" May Capone looked at her son for a long moment. Then she said, "Your father takes care of his family. That's what he does." It was true. It was also, Sonny understood, even at 12, not the complete truth, but it was all May was going to give him, and somehow it was enough for now. Then came February 1931. Sonny was 12 years old. In his second year at Catholic school, where he'd finally begun to settle, to find his footing, to be something other than simply Al Capone's son. His father was arrested and charged with tax evasion. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The newspapers covered every day of it in exhaustive detail. The charges, the evidence, the lawyers' arguments, the parade of witnesses. America had been waiting years for someone to bring Al Capone to justice, and now that it was happening, the coverage was nearly celebratory. front pages, radio broadcasts. The nation's appetite for Capone's downfall was enormous, and the media fed it without restraint. Sonny read the newspapers when he could, heard fragments of radio broadcasts, pieced together what was happening to his father from 100 partial sources. Because no one sat him down and explained it completely, his mother was protecting him, as she always had, and his father was dealing with a trial and not available for the kind of conversation Sonny needed. What Sonny understood by the end of October 1931, when the verdict came in and his father was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, his father was going away, for a long time, to a place Sonny had heard of but couldn't fully imagine. He was 13 years old. His father was going to prison. And the reason, the headline reason, the reason America celebrated, was because his father had not paid his taxes. Sonny didn't understand taxes. He understood absence. The 11 years of his father's imprisonment covered the most formative period of Sonny's life, 13 to 24. The years when a boy becomes a man, when identity solidifies, when the relationship of father either deepens into adult friendship or calcifies into something more complicated. For Sonny, those years happened with his father in Atlanta, then Alcatraz, then Terminal Island, always somewhere inaccessible, always under the supervision of the federal government, always mediated by visiting room tables and monitored phone calls and letters that arrived weeks late. He visited when he could. The visits were never enough. Alcatraz was particularly brutal. The journey from wherever the family was living to San Francisco, then the prison boat, then the supervised visiting room where everything was watched and limited and governed by rules designed for security rather than human connection. "How are you doing in school?" His father would ask, leaning forward across the table with the intense attention that Al Capone always gave to the people he loved. "Are you studying? Are you being good for your mother?" "Yes, Papa." "Good, good." A pause. "I'll be out soon. We'll do things. Go fishing. Go to the movies. I'll make it up to you." Sonny would nod. He was too old to believe in simple promises, and too young to stop wanting them to be true. May tried to protect him from the full impact of the absence, in the way she tried to protect him from everything. She was in many ways an extraordinary woman, dignified, loyal, private, fierce in the defense of her family against a world that was not kind to the wives and children of notorious criminals. She held things together during the prison years with composure that impressed even people who didn't like her husband. But she couldn't protect Sonny from the name. The Capone name was everywhere, not just in Chicago, where his father had built his empire, but across the country, in textbooks, in newspapers, in the casual conversation of adults who referenced Al Capone the way they referenced any cultural shorthand for American crime and excess. The name meant something to everyone. It meant everything to Sonny, and not always what he wanted it to mean. His father was released in 1939, when Sonny was 20. But the man who came home to Palm Island, Florida, was not the father Sonny had left behind. The years in prison, combined with the advancing neurosyphilis, had changed Al Capone in ways that were both visible and devastating. He was physically diminished, thinner, slower, less the commanding physical presence he'd always been. But the neurological damage was worse. The sharp intelligence, the quick humor, the overwhelming personality that had filled every room he entered, much of that was gone. On good days, his father was recognizable. On bad days, he was confused, repetitive, living in some internal landscape that Sonny could see but couldn't reach. "Does he know who you are?" Someone asked Sonny once, around 1942. Sonny was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said finally, "on good days." He cared for his father alongside May during the Florida years. It was not glamorous or heroic work. It was the ordinary, unglamorous work of caring for someone whose mind was failing. Medications, schedules, the patient repetition required when someone forgets what they've already been told. The grief of watching a powerful man become helpless. When Al Capone died in January 1947, Sonny was 28, old enough to understand the full complexity of what he'd lost, old enough to begin, finally, the long project of figuring out who he was when his father was no longer alive to define him. He changed his name to Albert Francis, not dramatically, not as a public statement or a press conference or an announcement of any kind, just quietly, practically, in the way a man puts down something heavy after carrying it too long. Albert Francis, his given names, just rearranged, stripped a surname that announced in every room he entered before he'd said a single word. The decision took years to make and a single afternoon to execute. He filed the paperwork, signed the forms, and walked out of the courthouse as someone who had ceased legally to be the person he'd spent 29 years being. It was anticlimactic. It was also one of the most significant things he'd ever done. He moved to Florida, not to Palm Island, not to the estate and its memories, but to the anonymous Florida that existed beyond all of that. The flat suburban Florida of ordinary people living ordinary lives in ordinary houses on ordinary streets, where nobody particularly cared who your father was because they had their own fathers to worry about. He found a job. The work was unremarkable. Management positions in restaurants and supermarkets. The kind of steady, unglamorous employment that keeps businesses running without ever making anyone famous. He was good at it. He showed up. He managed people fairly. He solved problems. He turned out to have a natural aptitude for the mechanics of running an operation, an aptitude that, had circumstances been different, might have led somewhere more notable. He married. He had daughters. He went to church on Sundays and mowed his lawn on Saturdays and watched his children grow up into people who bore no particular mark of what their grandfather had been. He became, as completely as he could manage, a regular person. The hearing aids continued, updated over the decades, less visible as technology improved, but still there, still marking him quietly as someone who navigated the world a little differently than most. It didn't entirely work. People found out. They always found out. A neighbor who recognized the resemblance to old photographs, a background check that turned up the original name, a careless reference in a conversation that connected thus that were, once you knew where to look, not particularly hard to connect. And when they found out, the questions began. Are you really? Is it true that your father? What was it like to be? He answered as little as possible. He didn't deny it. He had stopped lying about it sometime in his 30s, when the effort of active denial cost more than the discomfort of acknowledgement. But he didn't elaborate either. He answered the minimum question and turned the conversation elsewhere with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing exactly that for decades. He had spent his entire childhood and young adulthood as a supporting character in someone else's story. First in the story of Al Capone's rise, then in the story of Al Capone's fall, then in the story of Al Capone's decline. The story was always Al Capone's. Sonny was always someone else's son. He was trying, finally, to be the main character in his own story, even if that story was quiet, even if that story was unremarkable, even if that story ended without headlines or legacy or the kind of historical weight that had defined every other Capone who'd come before him. Unremarkable, he had decided sometime in his 40s, was exactly what he wanted. Unremarkable was a dream. For decades, mostly it worked. He found something resembling peace in the ordinariness of his Florida life, in the daughters who called him Dad without any particular weight on the word, in the neighbors who knew him as Al or Francis or whatever name he was using that year, and who didn't attach his face to a newspaper photograph from 40 years ago. The peace was real. It was also incomplete, because you can change your name and your address in your daily routine, but you cannot change the fact that some portion of who you are was built inside someone else's gravity. Sonny Capone had been formed, at the most fundamental level, by the experience of being Al Capone's son. That experience had given him his deafness, his bodyguards, his complicated childhood, his need for anonymity, his capacity for loyalty, his tendency toward quiet in a family of loud people. The father was gone. The formation remained. Then in 1988, Sonny Capone, Albert Francis, was 70 years old, and a journalist came to see him. He granted the interview after some consideration. He was old enough that the weight of never speaking had become its own burden. Old enough that the story was history now, safely distant, not the raw president had been for so long. And old enough, perhaps, to have figured out what he actually thought about his father, about the name, about the life he'd spent running from and toward in equal measure. The journalist asked the expected questions. What was your father like? What was your childhood like? Do you think what he did was wrong? Sonny answered carefully, as he'd always answered everything. with the quiet deliberateness of a man who had learned very early that words had consequences. Then the journalist asked, "Do you love your father?" Sonny was quiet for a long time, long enough that the journalist thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My father was the most loving man I ever knew. To me, to my mother, to his family. Whatever he did in the world outside our home, inside our home he was present. He was warm. He was everything a father is supposed to be." He paused. "He also gave me a name I've been running from for 60 years. And I'm still not sure, even now, whether that was his fault or the world's fault or just how things were." Another pause. Then, "I loved him. I still love him. And I'm still angry at him, sometimes for what the name cost me. And both of those things are true at the same time. That's what it's like to be his son." The journalist didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. He couldn't help who he was, Sonny continued. And I couldn't help who his son was. We were both just living with the consequences. The difference is, he chose his life. I didn't choose mine. He looked at the journalist with the steady gaze of a man who had spent 70 years looking honestly at something most people preferred to mythologize. "But I had a father who loved me. Some people don't have that. I know that now better than I did at 50 or 40. Whatever else he was, whatever else he did, he loved me. I was there for it. And that's real and it matters, and no newspaper story can take it away." Albert Francis Capone died in 2004 at 85 years old. He outlived his father by 57 years. He lived quietly to the end. No memoirs, no documentaries, no cashing in on the name he'd spent his life trying to put down. His daughters were with him. Somewhere in a box, presumably, were the hearing aids, the devices that had marked him as different since childhood, the physical reminder of a connection to his father that he never fully understood and never fully escaped. And somewhere in a record of that 1988 interview, preserved in a journalist's archive, were the words that had finally said what 60 years of silence had been unable to say. "He loved me. I was there for it. And that's real." The son of the most feared man in American history, reduced to the most human of statements. Not about empires or power or the mechanics of organized crime. About love. About presence. About what a father was underneath everything that fathers can be. Al Capone had built an empire. He had made millions, commanded armies, controlled cities. He had become a name that meant something to everyone who heard it, a symbol of American excess and violence and ambition. And the thing his son remembered, standing on the far side of 85 years of life, was that he showed up, that he was there, that the love was real. Some legacies are built of stone and headlines. Some are built of simpler things. The son knew which one lasted.